I buy assets when it's a buyer's market, and then I hold on to those assets. And as it turns into a seller's market, you don't necessarily have to sell. You can. I'm not big on selling. I'm a long-term guy. But when it turns into the seller's market, what you'll notice is those assets you purchased when it was a buyer's market, you really start to reap the rewards and the benefits of that. They really start churning cash, is what they start doing. They produce cash for you. So whether that's a business, whether that's real estate, whether that's stocks, whatever it is, if you use the sound fundamental principles that we talk about, it's not a get rich quick scheme. It's going to take time, but it really is pretty simple.
You're listening to the Purposeful Podcast.
Welcome to this episode of the Purposeful Podcast. I'm Matt.
I am Saki.
And we're glad to have you with us. And I'd like to first start out by thanking you for joining us. I'd like to let you know, please look for us on your favorite podcast directory. We're on Apple, Google, Spotify, anywhere you can find a podcast, you'll find the Purposeful Podcast. And if you prefer video content, you can look for us on YouTube and Rumble. We publish this podcast every week. New episodes drop on Sunday at 11 a.m. Central Time, and you can look for additional clips coming out throughout the week. So we'd certainly appreciate it if you do that. And if you like our content, please subscribe and please leave us some feedback. On this week's show, we are going to hit our usual segments. We're going to talk about giving back. We're going to do our savings hack of the week, and then we're going to go over some current events, really, and how those impact you, and maybe a way that you can think about how to position yourself to succeed given the environment. So we'll get into all those things as we move forward on the Purposeful Podcast. But before we do that, we're going to drop this to our intro.
You're listening to the Purposeful Podcast with Matt Fiebig and Saki Filios.
All right, brother. So let's start this off with our giving back segment this week.
All right.
I'm going to start with an organization that I know you're fond of, and I'm certainly fond of. It's called the Santa Rosa Kids House. Now, that is a place in Santa Rosa County, Florida, and they're really an interesting organization. They're advocates for children that are going through difficult times, some potentially abusive situations, things of that nature. But what they do is they bring all of the interested parties and services into the same location. So you have representatives from the healthcare industry who can examine the children for physical health. When they come in, you have mental health care professionals, you have representatives from the law enforcement community, and you have representatives from the state's attorney's office. And then you've got community advocates that are there as well, things like the Guardian Ad Litem program. So anyway, instead of a child who's in a difficult situation being trucked from this place to this place to this place to this place while they're being while their case is being looked at, it's bringing everything to the child, and that is meant to really reduce the stress and the impact of the event on the child so that it's not more difficult for them than it already is, considering the circumstances that they're in. And personally, you and I visited Psyche, and we saw what they're all about. And I know this is an organization that we both contribute to. It's something that we believe in, but it's a fantastic resource for this community. And when you think about philanthropy, a lot of times we like to think about bright and shiny and happy and smiley and the silver lining under the clouds and that sort of thing. But there are dark parts of the world as well, and the folks that do this really have a heart for children. And it's a nonprofit organization, so obviously they're doing this for the right reasons. I've got a couple of statistics to share, and then I'd like to get your thoughts because I'm sure you have something to say about them. So just in the year 2020, which is the most recent year that we have information, the Child Protection Team did over 220 medical exams and 295 forensic interviews. Law enforcement ended up charging 207 sexual offenses against juveniles, 98 child abuse offenses, and 47 internet crime offenses. Law enforcement brought charges. That's in one part of our community. The state's attorney's office had 26 cases that they brought against people who committed crimes against children that they were able to close. And the Department of Children and Families actually saw over 1,000 children receive services at the Santa Rosa Kids House, and over 827 free therapy sessions were given to affected children. So just think about that. I mean, the numbers they're not staggering for the United States, but they sure are staggering for our little community. One of the things about COVID that had some significant impacts that a lot of people don't think about or maybe didn't hear about was how domestic violence increased while people were locked down. And, a lot of the victims of that were children. So the services provided by this organization really were not only very needed, but even more so during the COVID-19 situation and the outbreak. So let me kick this over to you, Psyche, and get your thoughts on what they do over there.
Well, I have mixed emotions about it, and I'll clarify that. Obviously, I'm very thankful for the organization and to be able to have somebody like that in our community. They do a tremendous job. People that work there are phenomenal. They're dedicated. They really care, and we're lucky to have them. On the flip side, to hear you say those numbers you're saying is just, I mean, sad for lack of a better word, right? I wish we lived in a community or a country where we didn't have to deal with that, where the kids didn't have to deal with that. So that's where my mixed emotions come from. But obviously, very grateful to have the Santa Rosa Kids House around. As you stated, we both give back to them. I give my time, my services, and financial resources to them on an annual basis. And they're definitely an asset to our community. I'm glad you picked or highlighted this type of nonprofit organization because most communities have one. And it's kind of surprising how many people really don't know they exist. They provide an invaluable service.
They do. And I understand the mixed emotions, right? Because this isn't the kind of thing that you like to talk about, especially when you're talking about giving back. You want it to be upbeat. But the fact of the matter is, hey, this is a need, and our community needs this. Every community needs this because unfortunately, there are bad people out there. And one of the ways that we can give back is to meet the most vulnerable and to help take care of them when they're going through hard times. And the folks over there at the Santa Rosa Kids House, like you said, they do a fantastic job of it. You couldn't pay somebody enough to do what they do.
Nope.
And there are a lot of people over there that are just volunteering. They do it because of the compassion that they feel for those kiddos. So kudos to them. Fantastic work, and we love you guys and hope to see continued success for your organization going forward.
And thank you for your service and all that you guys do.
Amen.
The next time you decide to go pay for something, if you pay for it in cash, you will ultimately be better off at the end of the day. Numerous studies have been done over the years in the difference between paying with cash or paying with credit or debit. And the studies have shown that people that pay with credit or debit cards end up spending up to 83% more than people who pay with cash. And obviously, there's logical reasons for that. One, if you have cash, you're physically handing somebody over some money that you're counting out of your pocket. And swiping that card, it's kind of an out of sight, out of mind thing. But a second reason for that is you actually have a little bit more, even in this day and age, you have a little bit more negotiating power with cash. And retailers are more likely to negotiate with you because they don't have credit or debit card fees that they have to pay.
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I do know that there are certain vendors. I mean, honestly, go get your driver's license renewed. You'll find out
Yeah.
at the state level, they charge the transaction fees to you. The government is not paying Visa and MasterCard and American Express
This is true.
the transaction fees. So you obviously save, 2, 3, 4% by writing a check instead of swiping a card. But there are a lot of vendors that are adopting that as well. I've seen that increasingly at restaurants. I have seen that with service providers, especially if you think about someone like a roofing contractor, because I had this event with them. Um, you can spend $10,000-$15,000 easy on a roof these days. And think about 3.25% of a $12,000 check. That's a pretty sizable chunk of change. Uh, a lot of those kind of vendors are deciding, well, you know what, I'm not going to pay that. So if you want to pay with plastic, you get to pay the transaction fee along with it. So that's a huge way to save some dough.
Sure. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And on them larger transactions, if you can pay with cash, sure. I mean, think about that roof, let's say, for example. There's always upgrades you can purchase and someone's trying to upsell you. If you're paying with cash as opposed to financing it, that takes it to a whole nother level because it means so much more to you. If you're financing something, that's, like I said, even more exasperated than a credit or debit card because now you're breaking it down into small monthly payments, right? And now you're saying to yourself, oh, I can pay 9,000 for this, but if I get this, it's 11,000. And that only adds $6 a month. Well, that $6 psychologically is a lot different than $2,000 at the end of that term, plus the interest. So yeah, cash is always a better option if you can pay that way.
I'm going to start with some current events. Now, you and I were talking before the show. The news has been so bad lately. And, you and I are upbeat guys, and we try to look at, what's the most important thing? How do you live a purposeful and meaningful life? How do you take care of yourself, provide security for your family, and then do something important that makes you feel like you've accomplished something worthwhile? Well, it can get overwhelming when you think about, oh, inflation is this bad, recession is coming, gloom and doom and all that. And unfortunately, we can't really control the environment. That is what it is. And I think part of us doing our job is keeping you, the viewer and the listener, up to date on the current events that you need to know about. But I think going forward, we're going to try to be very deliberate about thinking and including advice about, okay, well, how can you turn this to your advantage? How can you position yourself so that you can still pursue the things that matter the most? Because, the truth is, the glass is half full, the glass is half empty. Well, a lot of life is how you look at it. And if you choose to say, oh, this is awful, what am I going to do? You may paint yourself into a bit of a corner Whereas if you look at this and say, times are tough, but opportunities abound, and if I play this the right way, I can really set myself up to accomplish my goals in the future. Well, guess what? Both of those things are true. So we're going to try to make sure that we're doing a better job of conveying that to you as well along the way. So with that, the inflation report was released for the month of March, and consumer prices were up 8.5%. So that's up from a 7.9% rate in February. That means, unfortunately, that inflation is continuing to accelerate. I've heard some voices out there saying, oh, well, this is as high as it's going to get. Things should start to slow down from here. I'm not personally convinced, but Psyche, I want to get your thoughts on where this is headed.
Yeah, I'm not convinced either myself. So, uh, in talking about the numbers that came out on the latest report, that's not surprising. We've talked about it on this podcast for the past couple months that we actually expected it to get a little worse. So that has happened. On the positive side, speaking of optimism, the interest rate paid on I bonds will more than likely go up at their next meeting next month. So anybody that has a little bit of cash that they don't want to put in a stock market, or excess cash they may have in their emergency fund, don't use your emergency fund cash. But if you built up a little excess, feel free to go out and buy some I bonds. It'll get you an 8.5, 9% return over the next 12 months, it looks like. Um, and that's, I guess, is as safe as you think the federal government is. So, but
I don't think
yeah,
there will be a default next month,
I,
or
I
even
don't think
12
so.
months.
Yeah, I don't see that happening either. So, yeah, I'm not convinced we're at the peak. Obviously, we all know eventually this is going to subside. I don't feel like we're quite at the peak. I feel like there's a little bit more momentum left. It doesn't seem like the momentum has stopped. I think we're getting closer. At the end of the day, ultimately, that just means, we've got to pay attention to how we spend our dollars, and keep our financial house in order.
Well, that's true. And I saw another story today that I think lends some credence to, what you just said, that maybe it's not going to slow down real soon. Wholesale prices were up 11.2% year over year. So, I don't see how you get wholesale prices at 11.2% and you don't see most of that being passed on to the consumer, because otherwise businesses start to fold. People are in business to make money, and they can't do anything except absorb part of whatever it is they think they can tolerate, but the rest of it they got to pass on to the consumer. And I think there's a reasonably good chance that you're going to continue to see inflation stay high. Now, there's a difference obviously between accelerating and maintaining. So when you think about acceleration, that's 1 month being at 6, the next month 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, so on and so forth. Well, if you hit, say, 8.5, and then you stay at 8.5 next month, and 8.5 the month after that, inflation is still really, really, really high, but it's no longer accelerating. The rate of inflation has stabilized. Now, ideally, what we'd like to see is the rate of inflation start to decelerate. So you go from 8.5 down to 7, down to 6, down to 5, until you get back to the goal, which is 2%, is where the Federal Reserve wants it to be. I think that we're a ways away from that, though. And the more I look into it, the more convinced I am that the Fed isn't being hawkish enough. They're talking about maybe doing a half of a point increase in interest rates at the next meeting in May. They did a quarter point in March. Well, I think it's going to take a lot more than that to tame things down. another thing you and I were talking about right before the show started was the money supply, right? Because that's the main driver of inflation, is how much money there is in the economy. And going back to right when the economy shut down for all the COVID lockdowns, spring of 2020 compared to where we are right now, the money supply in the economy has gone up by over 50%. So that's just staggering. And, so you got to look at, are we going to continue to pour more and more cash into the economy, or are we going to slow that down? If we slow it down, are we going to get to a point where at least we're not, adding into it significantly? And the answer is, I don't see that slowing down for a while. The Federal Reserve, I don't think, is going to be able to pull back enough money out of the economy to significantly slow things down without jacking interest rates up a lot higher than what they're talking about doing. And, the other side of this is the federal government, because they bring in a certain amount of tax revenue every year. Everything that they spend in excess of what comes in tax revenue, they have to borrow that money from somewhere to finance their spending. Now, you can do that through the sale of government bonds. So, the government goes out and says, okay, we're selling this debt. Who wants to buy it? Well, some of us here in the United States might buy some bonds. Overseas, you may have other citizens or governments buy bonds, whatever the case may be. But if the sale of those bonds doesn't bridge the gap, it doesn't cover the deficit spending, well, then what happens is the government goes to the Federal Reserve and says, we need you to buy these bonds, and then we're going to finance the debt that way. Well, the Federal Reserve buys those bonds by creating money out of thin air. And then that money goes to the federal government, who injects it into the economy. So that's the problem. And we're at a situation where the current administration's most recent budget proposal is $5.8 trillion, which is far in excess of what revenues are from taxes. So they're doing extreme deficit spending. Gone are the days, the simple days back in the early 2000s when we were simply running $200 and $300 billion deficits. Now we're running over $1 trillion a year deficits. Well, if the vast majority of that is simply money being printed out of thin air and going back into the economy, I don't think that that's going to help ease inflationary pressures. What do you do if inflation does continue to stay high?
Well, there's several things you can do. And one of the reasons we preach entrepreneurship is for environments like this. I think you and I and most entrepreneurs would agree. As an entrepreneur, small business owner, you can control your situation better than you can as a W-2 employee working for somebody else, right? And when inflation happens, you can either pass that cost along more by adjusting your prices, decide to pull back on your expense side a little bit. So there's multiple things you can do to adjust for higher expenses, less income, either way, whatever happens. You just have more control if you are a entrepreneurship. So that's one thing I always go back to. Find a way to get to a side hustle to bring more income in, right? That's the number one thing, because you always want to progress. You always need a bigger shovel. And then two is, you have to get your financial balance sheet, your house in order, right? Your financial house in order. You want to get your debt down in times like this. You want as much of your expense side to be gone, whether that's residual or reoccurring monthly expenses, whether that's a credit card debt or an auto loan debt. Get that stuff down where these external obstacles that are happening in the economy right now, they don't affect you as bad. And that's really what it comes down to. You can't expect anything the government does to bail you out, right? Um, and I don't mean that as a political statement. You and I both believe both parties have kind of failed us, right, in that retrospect. But you're the only one that's ultimately going to look out for yourself, right? The government's not going to bail you out. You need to take care of yourself. And the best way to do that is to have more income, less expenses. It sounds pretty simplistic, but that's what it is. It's what it comes down to.
Yeah, it's a big shift in mentality though, because what people get taught through experience, if nothing else, right, is you go out to the dealership if you're buying a car and they tell you, okay, well, look at the monthly payment. This is what you can afford. And you think about that in terms of your mortgage or your rent. This is what you can afford on a monthly basis. And what they're doing is they're pushing you to the upper limits of what your budget can accommodate. And if you get into a situation where, the advice that we've given before that you did on the savings hack, pay yourself first, right?
Yep.
That's the kind of mentality that you need to have. I'm going to take my paycheck. I'm going to set aside 10%, 20%, 30%, whatever it is that I've already pre-decided. I've already made the decision very deliberately. You set that aside. And then you go, okay, well, this is the budget that I have left to handle things like rent and groceries or a mortgage payment or a car payment. And what you've done is you've gotten yourself instantaneously into a better spot financially, because now you have your month to month, week to week, day to day expenses that are kind of in a bucket over here, and you've got money for that. And then you've got a bucket over here, and that's your savings, that's your investments, that's your rainy day fund, that's your security, right? That's where you take care of things. And that's also your opportunity fund, because the more money you have over there, the more opportunity you have to make decisions that are to your advantage. And that's one of the key things about this. Yeah, inflation's tough. And there's a good chance that there is going to be a recession because of the way things are going. But if you have prepared yourself for the opportunities, there will be opportunities that you can then take advantage of that will enhance your security down the road. I think it's just very important to have that mentality.
Oh, yeah, I agree 100%. So I'm a fan of the old Warren Buffett statement, and I get it. Gen Z and the younger generation, millennials. Warren Buffett is old. He's out of touch. He doesn't get it, but he's a value guy, right? And he's a long-term guy, and he's contrarian almost all the time. And what I mean by that is when the market appears to be red hot and it's a seller's market, um, that's not the time to buy, right? The time to buy is when it's not a seller's market, it's a buyer's market. And and let me kind of break that down because it's actually very important. Um, just to kind of give an example, back in 07, 08, 09, when we had the Great Recession, that's when I started buying assets. And that's what I mean by contrarian. I'm 41 at the time. Matt and I are the same age, so back then we were in our late 20s. So early start for us, to get on the financial road. So we were relatively young. It was our first recession to go through. Well, everybody else was selling, and you know, I was lucky enough, fortunate enough where I could buy. Um, so I was able to buy at a discount. Is really what it comes down to because it was a buyer's market. That's what I mean. We were in a period where there's not enough buyers and that makes it a buyer's market. Demand was down. So I buy assets when it's a buyer's market, and then I hold on to those assets. And as it turns into a seller's market, you don't necessarily have to sell. You can. I'm not big on selling. I'm a long-term guy. But when it turns into the seller's market, what you'll notice is those assets you purchased when it was a buyer's market, you really start to reap the rewards and the benefits of that. They really start churning cash is what they start doing. They produce cash for you. So whether that's a business, whether that's real estate, whether that's stocks, whatever it is, if you use the sound fundamental principles that we talk about, it's not a get rich quick scheme. It's going to take time, but it really is pretty simple and it works all the time.
What inflation actually is the loss of value in money. And so if you've got $10 today, a year from now, the way inflation is, you'll be able to buy the equivalent of $9 worth of stuff with that $10. So the purchasing power is going down. When you think about things like precious metals, because every time there's inflation, you hear all over the radio, all over TV, buy gold, buy platinum, buy silver. Okay, well, precious metals, what they do is they're a more stable store of value. So you may not be losing the value that you would if you stayed in cash. Your $10 today will still be worth $10 of purchasing power a year from now if you're holding that in gold. But when you purchase a capital asset, like a business or like real estate, something that not only has a tangible value to it that may stay the same or increase over time, but that is also a producing asset so that you're generating a cash flow along the way. I think that's where you really have an opportunity to set yourself up for success, because if you could buy something today for $10 that was still worth $10 a year from now, but that also made you an additional $3 between now and then, well, hey, I mean, that's even better. And if you hold on to something like that over time, especially in an inflationary environment, you not only retain the value of your wealth, but you actually put yourself in a position to increase your wealth, even though you're in an inflationary environment. And that's what I would encourage people to do, is look for opportunities right now. If you have the savings and if you have the cash available, to convert that cash into something that will not only retain its value over time, but that can actually generate income for you along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. And what I would encourage everybody is to not run out of patience. Very important, right? Because Matt and I are right there with you. We're out there looking for the same deal as everyone else. We're telling everybody else to look for. So um, it's hard. You want that deal, right? You want to move forward, but don't overpay for that deal. Don't run out of patience and make a hasty decision. You know, in my experience, the best deals are the ones that are win-win for both sides. And I know a lot of people listening probably don't think that's possible. How can buyers and sellers both win? Well, you can, and I'm here to tell you that. I've been involved in deals. Most of my deals, 95% of my deals, everybody wins. And the 5% of the deals where somebody doesn't win, it just doesn't end up good. You never, it's to have one person walk away from a deal feeling like they lost just doesn't end up good, doesn't build relationships. So you don't want to be that person that makes a purchase because you ran out of patience a little bit and you just wanted to get down the road so quickly that you end up being a person that regrets that purchase, so that decision. So just slow down. You might have to look at a little more deals than customarily you would have to look at, but it'll be well worth it in the end.
Yes, you're exactly right. And that brings us back to the kind of the fundamentals of what our program is about, right? Doing things purposefully and with intent. And one thing that you and I've talked about in the past is kind of the development of the individual as we mature. And in the beginning, when we're getting started as young adults, we're just we're trying to make ends meet. We're trying to balance our budget personally, make sure we can pay the bills, make sure, we maintain reasonably good credit. And if we're lucky, we start to save a little bit of money, right? But once you've managed to get stable, you put yourself in a position where you can enter the career growth stage. You can focus on advancing, you can focus on taking advantage of career opportunities, but you're still building something, right? Well, the ultimate stage, and this is something that you and I are both really big on, is the legacy stage, right? How do you put what you have to work accomplishing something that's important to you? What are people going to remember you for? Well, if you have a game plan for your life, whatever it may be, and you kind of understand what phase you're in and where you're trying to go, if you're making these kinds of decisions because they're helping you accomplish your goal, then you're doing the right thing. It may not always turn out the right way every single time, but you're making the decision for the right reason. And that's really the point. Don't do it because you're afraid of missing out. Don't do it because you're panicking. Don't do it because of an emotional impulse that says, I think I'm going to win big if I do this. Look at it objectively. Does this, by all reasonable measures, help advance me toward my goal? And if the answer is yes, it does, and it does so in a way that's worth the effort and worth the investment, then pull the trigger, whatever the economic environment is.
Yeah. Yeah. 100% agree. And if you do that, at the end of the day, you're a winner, right? Whether you win or lose in that particular deal, whether you have successes or failures, you're going to have failures, but just keep moving forward purposefully and intentionally for the right reasons. And it's going to turn out right for you in the end.
Absolutely. Well, believe it or not, I think that's a good place for us to end the program. It's amazing how fast you can blow through 35 or 40 minutes when you're having a good time.
That's it.
But for those of you that have hung with us the whole time, we certainly appreciate it. Once again, I'd invite you to please look us up on your favorite podcast directory. You can find us by searching for the Purposeful Podcast. If you look for us on YouTube or Rumble, you can look for us at Convergent Digital Media. You can also find us on Facebook at Convergent Digital Media, and you'll find our videos on all three of those platforms. And then we'd love to hear from you. So if you have some feedback or some ideas, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to address, you can reach out to us at the Purposeful Podcast at convergentdigitalmedia.com. So that's it for this week. Do you have any final thoughts?
Definitely check us out at our Facebook page, everybody. We regularly upload videos and little snippets of things and relevant articles that our community would like to read. So you check that out. Typically, just about every day, you'll see something new up there.
Absolutely. And we do value your time. So hopefully if we're putting it up there, it's something that you'll find interesting and relevant to where you are. So we definitely want to do that for you. We appreciate you, and hopefully we'll see you next time on the Purposeful Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Purposeful Podcast with Matt Fiebig and Saki Filios. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to join us on Locals at thepurposefulpodcast.locals.com and find us on YouTube and Rumble by searching for the Purposeful Podcast. If you like this podcast, don't forget to rate and review. This has been a production of Convergent Digital Media. Visit convergentdigitalmedia.com for more info. Thanks again for listening to the Purposeful Podcast.